$100 million companies. He's here to share insights on why toxic workplaces have high employee turnover. Please welcome Tom Kereszti. Hey, Tom.
Daniel, thanks for having me. Let's have some fun.
My pleasure. A couple of years ago, 2016, my wife Nini and I were down in San Diego, and it was one of our dreams for a long time. We had two dreams. My wife's dream was a hamburger plan. And I think, whenever we set a mission, we've got to have a good name to go with it. So her hamburger plan was to move back to America. And so she had lived in Hawaii, lived in Cleveland, Ohio, lived in San Francisco, and then she wanted to move to America. And so we had a hamburger plan. That was the image we had in our mind and on our vision board. Well, we didn't get to live there, but we definitely went and traveled to San Diego a couple of times for personal development. And it was an incredible place in the world. And I found that there was a bit of a buzz in San Diego, a buzz that, bigger is better and anything's possible. And it was quite contagious. So when we've been to San Diego, it's been always a wonderful experience.
Well, your wife has, congratulations, she has great taste because she talked about Hawaii. She talked about San Francisco. I also lived up in San Francisco for many years. San Diego. I don't know how Cleveland made it there, but
the way that she got to Cleveland is in her family, her mother's one of 6 children, and the 3 uncles. There was 3 uncles and 3 sisters. The 3 uncles, they went to America, and they had no English speaking ability, but they had a really good attitude. So to be able to get to America, in the wintertime here in Taiwan, they would plant rice in the rice fields. And then at nighttime, they'd sleep under a piece of corrugated iron. And they were willing to do whatever it took to make their life better. And eventually the 3 of them, 3 sons, made their way to America. One went to Texas, and he built a $1 billion business. And it was absolutely possible. And he started from nothing. Yeah. Another one went to San Diego, and he started to work in banking and finance. And the other son moved to Cleveland, Ohio, and became the head of America Post, leading 5,000 people.
Wow.
So when people say that your dreams and hopes and wishes and goals and ambitions aren't possible, I like to say, well, they are. And that was the long way that my wife got to Ohio.
I thought the story was going to be slightly different. The guy went to Texas. He started a $1 billion company. The guy went to Ohio. He became a postmaster. And the guy went to San Diego. He became a surfer.
I just am so impressed by what they've achieved, because it takes so much courage. One, to become a leader in your own life, to step out of the comfort zone, to leave the known and go into the unknown. It takes so much courage. It takes a lot of confidence. And I look at them and I think to myself, what an amazing journey to be guaranteed of no success, but to create it along the way. And I admire them a lot. My wife is currently studying a Master's of Psychology in Arizona. And she says, husband, this might be our ticket back to America. So she's got 1 month to finish her Master's of Psychology. And I'm very excited for her.
Congratulations. But I tell you, I think just reflecting on the 3 uncle stories, people in the U.S. are, they're complacent. They are, the fact that you live in the U.S. puts you in the top 10% of the world, even if you're on welfare. So you're sharing the story of the 3 uncles in the rice fields and sleeping underneath a metal shed. Um, like anything they would have achieved in the U.S. would have been an upside, right? It would have been successful. So they were not afraid of failure. They were not afraid of losing something because everything was an upside. And I think they were actually benefiting from that. They actually had an advantage over somebody who was born in the U.S. who kind of grew up on video games and everything was handed to them by their parents and, with 2 cars in the garage. For them, failure has a different definition than the failure definition for the three uncles. And you see that a lot from immigrants. They're not complacent. They do see the opportunities, and they're not afraid of failure because even if they fail, they're still better off than they were, before they got here.
Mm, mm. I agree. I've been an expatriate for 25 years and there's no backstop. And you've got to work hard, you've got to put your tail down and you've got to make it happen. Doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but you've got to find a way to make it happen. You've got to be flexible, you've got to adjust, you've got to learn new ways. And even for me here in Taiwan, I don't speak the language, but I understand the culture. And by
Yep.
understanding the culture, I can get along with everybody. And I think culture is one of those things that we talk about in business, but people still think it's something in a petri dish. And you don't want a culture that's based on a fear of failure. You've been around for a long time. You've done mergers of billion-dollar businesses. How does that fear of failure show up across an organization?
Well, let me speak about myself first because you said expat, right? I was an expat for about 25 years, and the shelf life of an expat is approximately 3 years. Right? You have 3 years to either succeed or fail, because by definition they put you into that assignment to fix something. They didn't put you in that assignment to retire you. They put you in that assignment because the business was not growing fast enough. The business was had to be structured, had to be turned around, acquisitions, mergers, whatever. Something had to be different, something had to change. So they put you in there as a change agent, and you have about 3 years to make that change happen and make it visible. And if it doesn't, you failed and you got fired. Or if you have succeeded, then they want you to do something bigger and better. So they say,
Mm,
okay, great on this one, Tom. We want to send you to country Y, and you've got a bigger challenge, laying ahead of you. So from my perspective, failure was automatic. Every 3 years, I either succeeded or failed. If I failed, then sometimes the company finds you you know a a safe spot back in corporate headquarters, or find you a lateral move or backward move to give you another chance. But most of the time, uh, people, and for me that was the same phase. One time I didn't turn the wheel, and it was time to go, and they gave me a spot back in corporate headquarters, and I said no thanks. I'd rather take my chance and stay in the expat world and find a different employer. And I had to kind of reinvent myself and brand myself. In fact, getting fired that first time was probably the best thing that ever happened in my life, because it forced me to look at myself as a brand and say, how do I market? I worked for branding companies, for consumer goods companies. It was all about branding. So I had to look at myself as a brand and say, okay, how do I represent myself as a brand? How do I position myself? How do I differentiate myself? What's my value proposition? And then I had another 20 years of a fairly successful expat life.
mm. 3 years, it's a short shelf life, isn't it? Very, very short period. It's
Yeah.
probably, it seems long at age, but it's short. You know, as an expatriate, knowing that your shelf life could be potentially 3 years, what did you have to develop in terms of emotional intelligence to be able to manage those challenges, to be able to manage the expectations, to be able to manage the fear of failure? What did you do to develop your emotional intelligence?
Um, Look, I developed a thick skin. And what do I mean by that? I developed thick skin in the sense that the first time that I got fired, I was devastated. I worked for a company for about 15 years, and every 3 years I got a new job, a new posting. And after 15 years, I got canned. And I was just, absolutely devastated by that. I didn't know what to do with myself. And then, like I mentioned to you, I branded myself. I positioned myself, and the way I did that is I kind of looked at myself and I said, look, uh, I got fired, but I didn't get fired from life. I didn't get fired for who I was. I got fired for what I did. And for 15 years, I equated with what I did with who I was. And then once that revelation came through to say, look, what I did is just the work. I mean, I still have the same values. I'm still this same guy. I'm driven the same way. Um, so how do I brand that? And how do I really get in tune with who I am as an individual? So my first rebranding exercise, I said, okay, well, what I do, and I looked at my career and I said, look, well, I'm pretty good in emerging markets, and I'm pretty good at taking something new and turning it around. So something failure that needs to be turned around, need to be fixed, or something starting up. So I'm a tinker, I'm a fixer of businesses, right? And so that's how I marketed myself. And then it probably took me about 40 years to ask these three questions. I asked these three questions for myself when I turned in my early 50s. Um, and it came from that original exercise when I got fired. It just evolved from there, right? So the first question was, who am I? And then I said, okay, well, how about asking the second question? And the second question is, what am I passionate about? What drives you? What makes me happy? What lights the fire under my rear end, right? And then the third question is, what am I good at? So I came with clarity probably in my early 50s in this, and I said, okay, who I am, I'm a servant leader. Um, in all my everything that I do, I try to serve. And what am I passionate about? I'm really passionate about making people better, making companies better, making products better. That's what makes me tick. And what am I good at? I'm pretty good at mentoring, and I'm pretty good at leading. Right. So when you have clarity on those three questions, and I don't know what your answers are, I don't know the answers in your audience, but if I was in your audience, I'd be getting a paper and pen out right now and writing that down and get clarity on those answers. Because, just imagine a Venn diagram, three circles that intersect, and each one of those circles represents an answer to that question. And with those three intersect, that's what your calling is. That's what you should be living. That's what you should be doing. That's your
Mm.
calling. And I say some people have jobs, some people have, do a little bit better. They have careers, and very few of us get to live our calling. So after I got clarity on that, I figured out what my calling is, and I got to live it.
So, as an exercise in emotional intelligence, there's three things that all of us, doesn't matter if we see ourselves as a leader or not, we should be asking ourselves, who am I? And the Greeks have been telling us to do this for 2,000 years. Man, know thyself. Secondly, it's what am I passionate about? And I think this is an important one because there's people out there who just want to make money and they're good at just making money. And if that's your superpower, I think that's very important to articulate to the world. And I know people who are so rich that the only thing they have is money. And they're excellent at it. But they're also intelligent enough to build a business and say, I'm excellent at bringing in the dollars, but I'm terrible with people. But they know it. So it doesn't inhibit their performance. And then thirdly, what am I good at? I think this is very important. And I've learned this from sport because when I was growing up as a wakeboarder, people would come out on our boat and they'd say, I want to do this trick. And I'd say, you want to do that trick? Just because you want to, it doesn't mean that you can. And they'd go out and they'd break an ankle. And I'd say, see, you got to get the foundations right. But not all tricks could be done by all people. And I think that's important.
No.
You've got to figure out what you're good at and then go all in on that. For me, maths is not my superpower. Emotional intelligence and developing people through coaching is my superpower. But I know it and I tell other people. So these three questions are really important.
I,
Who
I
am I?
want to just one more thing where you said, one guy is really good at making money. Um, I try to tell this to people that look, if you're set out to make $1 million, you may succeed or may fail. If you passion is to develop some widget, and that widget happens to make $1 million, then cool, because the $1 million or the making money is not your passion and purpose. That's the measure of how well you do on your passion and purpose, right? If you look at a business, every business functions on a P&L and L and a balance sheet, right? And if you're come to me and say, I'm going to grow my top sales line on my P&L by 10%, and I'm going to grow my profits on the bottom line by 25%, and that's my goal. I don't know if you're going to succeed at that. You probably fail at that because you don't have really a plan behind it. The P&L and balance sheet just measures how well you're running the business, how well you're launching those products, how well you communicate with your customers, how well you're treating your customers, right? How you managing your overhead. I mean, that's how you get your P&L, the P&L balance sheet combination. So that's just a measure. So if you're rolling in dough and you're making a lot of dough, that's a measure you're doing something right, right? But I don't think that's your goal. That's just my personal opinion.
Mm. It's an excellent feedback loop. And I know for leaders, they want to look at the numbers. There's a lot of things that they can track with numbers, and there's a lot of things that they can't track with numbers, meaning the non-financials. But it's real-time feedback. And I think that's important. And one of the things I learned studying neuro-linguistic programming was there's no failure. There's only feedback. And looking at the numbers gives you a real-time insight onto what's happening behind the scenes. Some people feel uncomfortable looking at it because, unfortunately, they don't like feedback. But as you know, coming back to the Tom Brady model, all athletes on a winning team are watching the scoreboard. They watch it the whole game. They see what's working and what's not working. They look to the sideline and they're getting real-time feedback from the coaching staff, and they're always course correcting. And they might have some temporary setbacks and injuries, but they're constantly moving, just 1 inch closer to that touchline every single play. But they've got to get the feedback. And the numbers just don't lie. So you've got to watch them.
Yeah, one more comment on failure. We have a tendency to over-exaggerate it. Like the short story I shared, I really thought my life was over. Like what do I do? And then within 3 months, within 2 months, I had a great job that I loved for a different company. So we have a tendency, even like Tom Brady, right? Okay, he gets sacked, right? So, oh my goodness, I failed as a quarterback because I got sacked. No, okay, you learn that maybe you had a blind blitz and nobody picked it up, so you learn from it. It's not the end of your life. It's not the end of the game. It was just one play.
Mm-hmm.
So let's not over exaggerate failure, which we have a tendency to do. Is just to say, look, accept it. Accept that in whatever you're going to do, you will fail, and it's okay. Just learn from it.
What do they say? We magnify our failures and we minimize our successes.
Could be.
And I think this is a culture that I see in Australia is we magnify the failure. We blow it out of proportion. We take the molehill and we turn it into a mountain. But it's not necessarily that way. In sports, I crashed more tricks than I ever landed. And that was the history of my 16 years as an athlete. I trained more than I competed. I thought about it more than I competed. And it was always in training for preparation for the competition. And the competition lasted all of 60 seconds, 2 30-second passes, but you might have trained a whole year or even more.
Absolutely.
The people who got caught up in crashing and wiping out and blew that out of proportion, making it so personal. I'm a failure. I can't do this trick. I'll never learn this trick. I'll never succeed in a competition. They personalize it rather than saying that trick didn't work for me today and putting it outside there and not making it personal. The ones who personalized it definitely stagnated. And I think the same thing in business is people say, well, my first business failed. That means my second business is going to fail.
You just
I, I
learn
would.
from the first failure, and then you don't make the same mistake.
Mm. But that takes emotional intelligence, doesn't it, to be able to self-reflect, to be able to sit down and think through. It's like what Brian Tracy says: knowing what I now know, doing a quick analysis, and course correcting.
Well, I think John Maxwell said it, or somebody else said it. I thought it was great. He said, "Look, experience is only good if you learn from it. Otherwise, it's just shit that happens to you, right? I mean, we all have experiences. Stuff happens to us, and if you don't learn from it, then what good is it? Then it's not really experience if you don't learn from it. It's just shit that happens to you."
Mm. One of the six forms of leverage is learning from other people's failures. And so, if we've had a failure, that's worth a lot of money to somebody else, especially as a consultant or as a coach, because you've learned what doesn't work. And I think that's also very important on the way to success, knowing what doesn't work, because there's some things that just don't work. And it's proven from multiple companies that this approach doesn't work. So why would you put yourself through all of that failure when you could just go and ask somebody who's failed? Hey, Tom, 15 years, tell me what didn't work. Daniel, I'll tell you it all. And start from
Well,
there.
Daniel, thanks for the plug, because that just says, look, go read Culture Work, because Culture Work has a bunch of stories in it that showed how I failed and what I learned from it. So there's a lot, Culture Work is not just a bunch of stories about peach and cream and everything is rosy.
Mm,
There's a lot of failures in that and what I learned. So uh, absolutely read it and you'll learn from it.
mm. One of my clients said to me, he said, Daniel, every time we have a bad hire in our business, it costs the business $1 million. And I said, good. Well, tell me what you did. And he told me all the things that he did, and I wrote it down on a piece of paper. And in the next consulting call, somebody said, Daniel, how do we hire the right people for the business? And I said, I've got $1 million case study here. This company lost $10 million last year. Let me tell you what not to do. We can learn a lot. In your book, Culture Work, what were some of those failures that you had learned from that you think are really important for people to know before they start the journey, or even to course correct on the journey that they're on now?
Well, one of the things that I think is very important for people to realize is there's two things in any business that are non-negotiable, right? You can have a chat about it all up front. Let's say you're starting a business and you don't know what your culture is and you don't know what your vision is. Have all the debate that you want. But once you identify what that is, the debate is over. Now everybody has to be on board. And one of the, I would say, the key things for any organization is to understand what their culture is, and that becomes a non-negotiable, right? You can't have people not buying into the culture. You can't have people not behaving, not acting towards that culture, right? Because then you don't have a culture. Culture is not something that's on a board. It's not something on a poster on a wall. It's on your website. It's the living DNA inside of an organization. It's how people interact with each other. It's how people treat their customers. How people treat their vendors, their suppliers, their employees. Those are the things that make up the culture. Behavior, and if somebody doesn't buy into that behavior, then they don't belong on the team. You got to cut them loose. You got to cut them out. And the same thing with vision. There'll be another book, just as a background for you and your listeners. My first book was called C Suite and Beyond, and that talked about the five keys of successful leadership models. And the first key was culture. So I wrote Culture Force, which is the first book on organizational culture, and there'll be another book on vision and strategy, and then two more books on the other topics. But I always said culture and vision is non-negotiable. Um, you have to have and let's just say, for example, we talked about mergers and acquisitions, right? We've had, I've done mergers and I've been part of mergers, and when you have two companies, on most likely you'll have two different visions and two different cultures, and you can try to bulldoze one culture into the new organization, Well, that's probably not going to exactly work. You can also not let it linger to say, okay, well, company A had culture A and company B had culture B, so we'll just kind of get along, for the next 10 or 15 years. That doesn't work either. But what does work is looking and taking the best of culture A and culture B, getting those teams together and say, okay, what is going to be our culture going forward? It may be predominantly culture A, but you still make some elements from culture B and mix them into the culture A to really bring those people along that were in company B and to buy into the new culture, right? So you have to have some kind of hybrid. Um, you could potentially, right, have culture A dominate and then just be ready that a lot of you stars that were in culture B, they're going to exit. Right? They're just going to quit the company because they didn't sign on to that. That was not for them.
Mm.
One of the examples, which is a pretty interesting example, is Bankiser and Reckitt and Coleman merged. And the way that happened was Bankiser was actually on fire. It was a rocket ship. I worked for that company. Very entrepreneur, and a lot of risk, high risk, but they were growing as the fastest pace in that industry. And Reckitt and Coleman was pretty much flat. Their sales was growing like maybe 1, maybe 2% a year. So their board got frustrated, and they knew that Bankiser was looking for acquisitions, right? So in fact, what they did was Reckitt and Coleman purchased Bankiser, but Bankiser became all the executives from the Bankiser team became the new executives of the merged companies, right? So it was quote unquote a minority shareholder takeover, right? And Bankiser was really simple, and it's in this book. This example is in this book. Every general manager in every operating subsidiary had three things: sales, profits, and working capital. Now, if you hit your targets on sales, profits, and working capital, you can make up to 120% of your base salary. So it was, I'm not talking about stock options. I'm just talking about annual bonuses. So it was aggressive, but the local general managers were also empowered to do what they had to do. So nobody was micromanaging them. They were taking risk. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work, but they were incentivized with a very aggressive growth structure, and that was the kind of the mindset. And then after the merger, right, even though Benkisa took over with that mindset, and their management team led the new structure, within about a year, a lot of the cross-functional matrix-driven indicators kind of were retained from Reckitt. So here's the general manager now sitting in the same country he was sitting in 2 years before, a year before, and he doesn't have control over those three indicators because he can't take the risk he wants to take anymore. Right? There's all kinds of guardrails from people back in corporate headquarters or divisional headquarters. So all those entrepreneur mindset guys left the company within 5 years, right? Because because the culture changed, right?
Mm.
They were entrepreneur mindset. They were high risk takers. They were highly rewarded for taking those risks and growing their business exponentially. And then the model changed. So a lot of it goes in fact, a lot of the guys that were on the leadership team that were put into executive VP positions when Benke's the merger, that were those types of entrepreneur mindset, those guys left as well,
Mm.
not just the local general managers, right? Because you play with culture, people don't stick around.
Mm. Mm. There was a number on your website, and it said that 70% of culture transformation efforts fail without systemic leadership pipeline. How did that show up in this situation?
Well, this is what leadership multiplication is about, right? Leadership multiplication is about looking at an organization and make sure that you raise up future leaders that retain that culture, right? If you have a leadership gap, I mean, a culture is not going to sustain itself without people sustaining it. And if you're not constantly raising up people throughout your organization to sustain that culture, pretty soon you look up, you don't have that culture anymore. It kind of disappears. So you have to have some kind of systematic process that raises these leaders up on a continuous basis to retain that culture. Otherwise, if it depends on one person, once that person is gone, the culture is gone.
Mm. So if I have a look at the numbers on your website, $50 billion a year is spent annually on leadership development and workplace initiatives. Why doesn't it work? If we're spending 50 billion a year, why doesn't it work? And then secondly, how do we make it work? How do we get a return on that investment?
Well, in a typical company, where the number comes from is you're trying to train leaders instead of integrating into the DNA of the organization behavioral patterns, right? So you're pouring money into individuals instead of pouring money into making sure that the culture inside that organization develops those leaders rather than outside forces, right? Because people come and people go, especially in a bad company that has a bad culture. People tend to leave a lot more. So you're spending a lot of time developing leaders, spend a lot of money on that, and then many of those leaders check out after a year, after 2 years, because they don't like the culture. Right? So you spent a ton of money on them, and they go out, exit left, right? And by the way, another statistics that's out there on the website is we think that we can fix money, we can fix problems, people problems like money. When you look at salaries, it's like number 7 or number 8 on the list of why people stay or leave an organization. Right?
Mm,
It's low on the list.
mm,
But things like empowerment, very high on the list. People, things like trust, very high on the list. So if all you're doing is spending money training leaders on behavior, but you don't have an organization that actually rewards trust inside of an organization. You don't have an organization that actually rewards empowerment inside of an organization. If you don't have an organization that actually rewards you investing your time instead of into projects into developing other leaders, right? Imagine if if your incentive as a leader was not on what your sales line is, but how many good salespeople you developed inside your organization.
mm,
Right? If that Imagine if that was your KPI. Right? Your KPI wasn't, hey, my team actually sold 100 million. If the indicator was 3 people from my team got promoted into higher sales positions in other divisions of my company, where would you put your effort? You would put your effort into developing better salespeople, a better sales team. Now, as a side benefit, I would imagine that your sales and your team also go up because those people become better salespeople. But
mm,
it's not just about what that sales target was; it's how many people to develop that became better leaders inside your organization that you can transform into other parts. Um, we were doing a mastermind in New York City for a bunch of high level executives, and um, one of the guys said, guys, it's like so trying. I hire somebody, and then the onboarding and the training is so much effort and so much money. Is there a better way? And I simply said, look, now imagine if you hire somebody and you don't do that, and they stay. Instead of leaving, because his point was, I'm making all this investment, and then 3 years down the road they leave the organization. Well, okay. I said, what's the alternative? They come into the organization, you don't do any of that, and they're there with you for the next 10 years, right? Which one is better? So make that investment, and
mm,
make that investment that they may leave after 3 years. But what I would, and this is also one of the comments I made inside of culture work, is to say chances are likely that those people, if you give them the right opportunity and the right progression, they'll stay within inside your organization, because with the bonuses and everything else that you put together for them, they're not going to want to leave, right? So yeah, if Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos calls and said, "Look, we're going to give your employee $1 billion to come join our company, or 100 million to join our company," yeah, I'll help them pack. But that's the rare case, and people will have loyalty, and they'll rather stay with your organization, even maybe for less money.
Mm.
But the bonuses, they're probably, maybe their base may be less, but with the bonuses, the way you put it together, where they're empowered, they succeed, and your company succeeds, they'll stay.
I agree. And in my studies, I learned that 88% of employees, new employees, complain about the onboarding process. They join this company and the onboarding process is atrocious. And within that first 24 hours, they also make the decision, will they stay or will they leave the company? So almost 9 out of 10 people complain. And then in 24 hours, they make the decision if they're going to stay or go. And I've been down that path before. I remember one of my first jobs, I was a paper boy. And I worked for my uncle and he gave me a 3-step sales process. There's the door. There's the papers. Go make sales. And I thought it was going to be easy as 1, 2, 3. And I went out the door. I didn't know what a customer looked like. I didn't know the reasons why people would want to buy a newspaper. I didn't even know that there was people who would buy and who wouldn't buy. And I spent a lot of my time trying to sell newspapers to people who couldn't read English, to people who didn't even care about the news. And all of that rejection was frustrating because I thought, couldn't have I just learned that and avoided that from the start? Hey, this is a customer. Put the bullseye on their head. Go and talk to that person. But I didn't have that. And it was a stressful experience. But when I joined Emirates Airline, we're talking about the Sydney Harbour Bridge before. I was driving over the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I looked up, there's this big white building. On the top, it says Emirates Airline. And I thought to myself, I've already lived in Dubai. I'm going to go apply for a job with Emirates. And I looked in the newspaper that day and they were recruiting in Sydney in 2 weeks from now. And I went to the interview and the interview process was phenomenal. And they cut down the group from about 150 down to about 15 candidates. And I looked around the room and I said, these are the 15 people that I would love to work with. Did some psychometrics testing to make sure that I wasn't a serial killer yet. And went through the recruitment process and they called me back and they said, Mr. Tolson, congratulations. You've made it. We're going to offer you a job. And I said, thank you so much. They said, you can start in 6 weeks. I said, well, how about 6 days? I want to get started. And they said, we'll see how fast we can do it. So probably about 3 weeks later, I was back living in Dubai. And it was an interesting experience because the onboarding started before I even left Australia. They groomed me. They told me this is what's going to happen. I got to the airport. Mr. Tolson, welcome to the team. I got on the aircraft. The cabin crew said, Mr. Tolson, welcome to the family. I got to Dubai and they had a big sign that said Marhaba, which was Arabic for welcome. And it said my name. And they said, Mr. Tolson, welcome to Dubai. They took me to headquarters and they said, we know you're young. We know Dubai's expensive to live in. Here's an envelope of cash. You don't have to worry about money. They put me in a bus. They took me to a hotel and they said, Mr. Tolson, this is your hotel apartment. You'll be living here for a year. Don't worry about cleaning. We'll take care of all that. You've got your own bedroom, your own ensuite. You've got a fridge. You've got a washing machine. You've got a dryer. You've got everything you need. Bus will pick you up tomorrow morning, 6 a.m. to take you to college. I get there first day at aviation college, and here's my 6-week plan of everything that I'm going to learn over the next 6 weeks. I did that, and they said, now, Mr. Tolson, you've passed all of your exams. You can operate on Airbus. You can operate on Boeing. Here's your development plan to become a leader. And it was the most phenomenal onboarding process. And although I'm not working with the company now, I've become a brand advocate and a loyal customer. And it was such a wonderful experience. And I knew exactly what I was going to be doing at every stage. And they had thought it through. And I looked around at the people I worked with and I said, these are the best of the best of the best.
But look, that's the difference, right? You mentioned that some people within 24 hours have a terrible experience because of the onboarding. And why is that? The reason is because the company doesn't know what their processes are. The company doesn't know what their culture is. They don't know how to immerse somebody, and that's what their onboarding is terrible because they haven't figured it out. So it's like everybody, every man or every woman for themselves. With Emirates, obviously they figured out what's their culture, what's their trigger points, what makes them successful, and they had an entire onboarding process to bring you inside that culture and make you share that vision with them. There's a lot of companies that are just confused and don't know. They don't have clarity on that, so they can't onboard because they don't know. I mean, I can use my kids. My middle child. I won't name the company, but she worked for a company, and they sold her. They said, "Oh, come join us." She's a high flying salesperson. "Oh, come join us." And then I'm on the phone with her, and she's like, figure it out. There is no onboarding, right? It was she had a terrible experience, and she lasted a year there, and she left, and she went to a different company that had a much better onboarding job. She's very happy there, but that's the difference between successful and struggling companies. The successful ones like Emirates figured out what the
Mm,
business model is, and they figured out how to onboard. We had I mentioned the book VMware, which is Pat Gelsinger. I mentioned he was the CEO at that time, and Leslie Orr was the VP of HR. And I spoke to her, and whenever somebody comes in, they have what they call a total immersion. So for the first 3 months, that person doesn't really do anything in project work or anything like that. They kind of get immersed into the VMware culture, and until it becomes part of their genetics, until it becomes, and that's only after 3 months, after they absorb all that, they
mm,
start leading or working on projects. They call it a total immersion program, and it's a 3 month process. So they take the hit. They know, we're going to hire you, and you're not going to be productive for the first 3 months, because for the first 3 months you're learning. You're just getting totally immersed, and they're successful. VMware is a very successful company.
On your website, you have a lovely gold embossed seal, and you're DISC certified. In your coaching and development, how do you use the science of DISC to develop your leaders? How do you use that technology?
Well, I use it not only for leadership development, but for team composition. I am a big advocate of what I call diversity of mindset. And many, many, many years ago, when I was young executive, I found that there are certain people I just couldn't get along with. Right? One type of
Which
person, I
which
call them.
which style?
Like, so one person, what I would call them procrastinators, right? I say, man, all you guys are freaking procrastinate. Just get off your asses and do something. And those procrastinators just turn out to be very analytical, detailed oriented individuals. They
You're not
couldn't
talking
make a
about the C
decision without
style, are you?
right. So in my mind, you have to do two things as a good leader, and you use a tool like this. The first one is make sure that your team comprises of all the D's, the I's, the S's, and the C's,
Mm,
because then they balance each other. If you have a bunch of D's, they're going to go off and they're going to make sure that project is delivered on time in September of 2026. Now, it may be the wrong project, it may be heading in the wrong direction, but it will be delivered on September 2026. So you need the C's on there, right? You need the other individuals on there to balance that diversity of thought. And then the second thing is you got to get them to get along, right? Because
mm,
if you kind of just put a bunch of DIs and SCs into a room, they're gonna knuckle heads, right? Because they don't think alike. They solve problem differently. But if you get them to appreciate how the other person thinks, how the other person communicates and solves problems, then instead of having one answer to a problem, you're going to come up with three or four different answers to a problem. And what a wonderful thing to have choices. Maybe the first answer was right, but maybe the third solution is much better than the first solution that was. So
mm,
just make sure you got a balanced team of diverse thinking, and we are so hung up on diversity, especially in the United States. I don't know, Taiwan or Australia, but in the US we're like, oh, diversity, diversity, diversity. And it's a bunch of baloney, because it's
Mm.
about skin color,
Yep.
it's about gender, and it's not about, if you got a whole bunch of, Latinos, a whole bunch of African American into the same room, and they all think alike, you haven't done a diversity. You
Mm.
just kind of skewed it in one direction. So,
Mm.
sure, there is diversity. Like I've worked on teams, and the people in Brazil, and I don't mean to stereotype, but the thought process in Brazil is going to be different than the thought process in Germany,
Mm.
right? So there is some nuance on, where you come from, geography, whether you're a male or female. So there is a component of diversity in that, but it's really focusing on not the skin color, not the gender, but focusing on how they think, how they solve problems, how they communicate. And if you get that diversity of mindset into a room and get them to appreciate each other, then you got gold.
I love DISC, and DISC has a very special place in my heart, and so does San Diego, because the first time I learned about my DISC style was with a workplace psychologist in San Diego. And I was trying to solve that question: who am I? You know, what you mentioned before, the first question. And I'd done a coaching program back in 2009 in Colorado, and the trainer facilitator was doing a lovely job. And they said, Daniel, in today's topic, we're going to learn to coach from center. And I said, coach from center? What does that mean? They said, from the center of who you are, your being, your essence. I said, well, what does that mean? Can you quantify it? Can you label it so I can understand? They're like, you just have to figure it out. Your center. I'm like, I've been trying to figure it out for 32 years. And so I was struggling with this coaching from center. And then I met a workplace psychologist, went to San Diego, and she said, Daniel, before you get here, I just want you to complete this questionnaire. And we got there and we sat down in a hotel. My wife's next to me, and she starts to debrief me on my DISC report. And I looked at my wife and I said, did you rat out on me? Did you tell her what I'm really like? She's like, I haven't spoken to her before. And I said, how is it possible that she knows all this about me? And the big one that came through for me, Tom, was she said, Daniel, you're a high D. And I said, what does that mean? She said, well, for you, it's results above everything else. You just want to win. And I said, that's me. She said, are you using that superpower? And I said, no, it gets me into trouble. She said, you got to start to use it. And for me, when I was in corporate, I just wanted to win. I wanted to break the rules. Why do we have to do it like this? Fuck that. I want to do it my way. But I learned that got me into trouble. So I had repressed. It was like I put on a mask. But once I got into my own business, I needed that superpower, but I had been afraid to use it for a long time. And I said, yes, that's me. I am angry. I do get frustrated. I want to share. I blow up like a firework and get out of my way. And it was liberating because I was like, that's me. No more hiding.
You're 100%. You got to brace your strengths. Don't run from it. Don't hide from it. Just, understand what your strengths are. So embrace that, and then understand where you're not good, and
Mm.
surround with yourself with people that are good at that. Right. So, and then you have a healthy team. And one of the other things on the website you didn't point out, but on the services you'll see a tab for Piloteer. Now this is DISC on steroids, because what happens with DISC, it's a moment in time. You take a DISC assessment. Now, I've been pretty consistent over the last 20, 30 years, and it doesn't matter if I take Myers and Briggs or DISC or LSI or Strength Finders. I come up pretty much the same profile. They all have a different definition of it, but it's pretty much they put you in one of four buckets. And I've been fairly consistent over the last 25 to 30 years. But again, it's a point in time.
Mhm.
Now, what we do with Piloteer, it's an AI-based software, and this wasn't possible 4 years ago. This is only possible in the last 2 years since AI exploded. And you put your disk profile in, so Piloteer knows what your disk profile is, right? And then, like if we're discussing right now, if Piloteer was part of this discussion, it would be analyzing what I say, how I say it, my facial expressions. Same with you. And at the end of this discussion, it would give me a report. It would give me a benchmark, right? That's from 0 to 5. Tom, your communication, you did a 2.5. You could explain, there's 3 or 4 points you should explain much better in detail so people are going to understand it, right? Or Tom, your empathy sucked because you cut Daniel off all the time. You didn't let him talk, right? You weren't listening, right? So it gives you feedback like that. In fact, even while we are speaking, a little window would pop up and say, Tom, explain this better, or Tom, back off, you're talking too much. And then it will benchmark you. If a whole organization takes on this tool, it'll benchmark. You and I work for the same organization. It'll benchmark you and I against each other. But the whole idea is about constant improvement, because this is a time, and you know this because you're an executive coach, right? So you meet with a client, and when I coach people, I meet with them usually once a month. I talk to them weekly, so maybe it's like a 10-15 minute check-in once a week, and then it's a more thorough debrief once a month.
Mhm.
But I have no idea what that client is doing in the conference room. I have no idea what the person is doing. I can only know what the client tells me, and hopefully the client is honest with them. But with Piloteer, um, that person, that client, can see what they're doing in lifetime on 12 indicators of leadership. And I'll also see it. So it's not a tool to spy on that individual, but it's a tool to better that individual so they can improve themselves. And I got a snapshot into their life that I normally wouldn't be able to get a snapshot into their life. So I can give them more constructive feedback, right? It's a
What an
great thing.
incredible piece of technology.
Yeah.
I better take it myself.
Hey, please.
I'll be there. I'll be lining up. Tom, thank you so much for joining me today. Where can our audience get a copy of your latest book?
So culture work, I'll do one better. Um, Archway Publishing, Simon Schuster Archway Publishing, to publish a book, and they give me a bunch of free codes for free downloads. So for your audience, the first 50, so I'll make available 50 codes for your audience. So the first 50 that email me with a simple message that says, I want a free copy. And they can just email that to tom@culturework.org. So it's the name of the book, Culture Work, WERK.org, Tom at, and just email, you want a free copy, and I will send you a free code so you can download a free copy. And all I
You'll
ask you
see.
is just read it. So if you're not going to read it, don't ask for the free copy, but please read it. And if you benefit, or your company benefits, or whoever you think could benefit, just forward it to them. Spread the news forward, and even better if you could leave a good review on Goodreads. I don't know if you know Goodreads, but Goodreads is just leave a review, hopefully positive, on Goodreads. I would be very grateful.
Well, you'll see my name pop up there in about 60 minutes from now. It'll be there. Tom, thanks for your time, and thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you so much.